Hello, class. This is a slideshow that will give you a few what I think are the important highlights from Heather Mac Donald's book, The War on Cops. So let us get started. She begins the book by providing a critical analysis of the hands up, don't shoot slogan that really caught fire starting shortly after the shooting of Michael Brown by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Despite the riots and the hysteria that followed, the Department of Justice investigation of the incident found that the officer was in fact justified in shooting Michael Brown. This is because they could not find a single credible witness that could testify that anything like hands up, don't shoot happened during that incident. In fact, the witnesses that did come forward reported what the officer reported, that Michael Brown punched the officer in the face, and as the officer was trying to recover, he was charging the officer, and so he shot him dead. And officers must assume if they're willing to fight you, then they're willing to kill you and take your gun in the process. But yet we see, as you can notice in the picture on the right, with the CNN anchors all posing there with their hands up, further giving some false credibility to this hysteria. But nevertheless, it's not as if the entire media institution was in on the hysteria. The Washington Post gave the hands up, don't shoot slogan story 4 Pinocchios. That this is a rating scale that they give for stories that are complete fabrications after the fact. And this is a fabrication that further fueled the social movement known as Black Lives Matter. Now, while hands up, don't shoot, the Michael Brown incident was unfortunate and it created a lot of hysteria and really negative fallout, a much more serious issue that Mac Donald presses on is the black-on-black violence rates that, according to her, preventing them should be the civil rights issue of our day. That just consider some of these numbers here. Annually, there are about 6,000 blacks murdered every year. This is an average over the last 10 years or so. This is a rate that's higher than whites and Hispanics combined. So the black homicide rate is about 8 times that of Hispanics and 12 times that of whites. And just to focus in on New York City, for example, 70% of all shootings in New York City are committed by black males. But black males are only about 6% of the population. And you see other similar disparities in other cities. And so you can see on the graphic on the right that appeared in the well-respected publication, The Economist, the disparities between blacks and non-blacks in the nation as a whole in terms of homicide rates. And in the United States, no one should have to live like that. No one should have to live under the threat of really high risk for homicide. And so we have to take her claim seriously that this should be the civil rights issue of our day. Because in the United States, we expect law and order to be the norm, not Hobbesian anarchy in inner cities. Well, what has worked in the past, she argues, should continue in the future, and that's what's under threat. So this comes under several different labels: broken windows policing or order maintenance policing. She argues that this is what has saved black lives, much more so than talking heads and political action groups like Black Lives Matter, despite its unpopularity. And this started first in New York City with what they called CompStat. So this is just the analysis of statistical data, the kind of nerdy stuff that I and some of your other professors are into, that looks at the prevalence of crime in certain hotspots in cities and then directs officers in those areas to prevent violence from happening in the first place. So that way cops can actually prevent crime. They're not just the cleanup crew and taking interviews from people after the shooting has already occurred. And so this is also known as just generally intelligence-driven policing, which spread to other cities and is estimated to have prevented well over 10,000 deaths of black males because of its preventative nature. Yet, in 2013 in New York State, stop and frisk, or what's really stop, ask, and frisk, was found to be unconstitutional. One of the arguments was that it unfairly targeted black men. In fact, it was trying to protect black men from other black men. Well, in the wake of Michael Brown's death, there were riots in Ferguson, Missouri, and in other U.S. cities. And if you can look on the graphic on the right, homicide rates started rising in 2014 after 2 decades of it declining, and the homicide rates went up the most in cities that had the highest or higher percentages of blacks. And how this happens is that police become reluctant to make stops and to do searches due to political pressure. And when police back off, criminals are emboldened, and the black-on-black violent crime rate increases. And this is what this is what Heather McDonald calls the Ferguson effect. And to make matters worse, the commander-in-chief at the time, President Obama, chastised the FBI director, James Comey, for making similar statements. And mainstream media also made the problem worse by attempting to explain away the riots in these cities and the homicide rates in majority black cities as a result of poverty, that it almost like this was inevitable. And it's not inevitable. Poor people, just by virtue of being poor, don't shoot at each other. These things fluctuate over time, and they can certainly be influenced by politicians and poor policy making. In this case, it was the diminution of a policy, stop and frisk, and proactive policing. And so to continue with the highlights from the book, The War on Cops, there is the issue of black and unarmed, which is one of the claims made by the media and Black Lives Matter, that there is an epidemic of police officers killing unarmed black men. Never mind the fact that the word epidemic is being misused there, as it's often used when describing other violent crimes, like the so-called epidemic of women being sexually assaulted on college campuses. But let's just focus here on the issue at hand. So if we look at lethal encounters between police and pedestrians, we find that 40% of cop killers are in fact black, and 26% of suspects killed by police are black. We should note, though, that the vast majority of suspects killed by police were in fact armed, white, black, and Hispanic alike. Perhaps no surprise, cops usually will not use lethal force against somebody who is unarmed, but if they see a gun being pointed at them, you better believe that they're going to return fire. And in 2015, 256 blacks were killed by the police. This is to be compared to the 6,000 blacks killed annually, mostly all done by other blacks. And this is generally true of violent crime, that most violence is intraracial. That is, if you're white and you're listening to this, you have a much greater chance of being killed by someone who is also white, rather than being killed by someone who is black or Hispanic or Asian or somebody just non-white. So that's not something particular to blacks. That's just generally true of most serious violence. It's intraracial. Okay, so if we look at the percentage of blacks being killed by police as a percentage of the overall black homicide rate, police are responsible for about 4% of black homicides. versus police being responsible for about 12% of white homicides and Hispanic homicides. So, somewhat shockingly, but true to the numbers, Heather Mac Donald points out that an anti-police slogan based on the risk of being killed by a police officer versus a pedestrian would more truthfully read, white and Hispanic lives matter, just because of the higher risk. If you're going to be killed, there is a higher risk of being killed by a cop if you're white or Hispanic, which totally runs counter to the Black Lives narrative, which we need to have a honest discussion about this and acknowledgement of these numbers, because if we start getting away from the numbers, then we're all in trouble here, because it's going to end up hurting the very people that we would hope to protect, those at the highest risk of serious violent crime. And if we focus on the cases where police do kill unarmed civilians or unarmed suspects, the unarmed black victim category actually conceals the suspect's behavior and other situational factors. That oftentimes what happens in these incidents, and they're unfortunate whenever they happen, that the suspect is fighting with the police. And so cops have to assume if the suspect is willing to fight you, he's willing to kill you. So we got to acknowledge that. Other times there are cases where a suspect unfortunately gets hit by a stray cop bullet. It's an unintended target, but this media will almost invariably treat this as a murder by cop situation, which is totally dishonest and doesn't help anybody, I don't think. Towards the end of the book, while I'm skimming over some of the very interesting issues that she brings up about prison reform, just focusing on the chapter that's titled A Racist Criminal Justice System, question mark here. And so if we focus on the issue of the war on drugs supposedly being disproportionately directed at blacks, a lot of times what pundits will argue is that the crack cocaine sentencing disparities are a clear case of a racist criminal justice system. And while it is true that they've had a disproportionate effect on black defendants, especially at the federal level. So 81% crack defendants in the federal system are black versus only about 27% that were white, and that's in 2006. And these numbers have gone down a little bit since then, but it was at its height in 2006, and a few years before that. You are looking at a racial disparity, granted. But if we compare that to the number of blacks that are incarcerated for reasons other than crack, blacks incarcerated for crack charges, at least at the federal level, represent less than 1% of all blacks incarcerated. So it just doesn't follow. Black incarceration is not a result of the war on drugs. Most of it is a result of violence and property crime. The vast majority of it is. It's not about drugs. It's about predatory criminal behavior, usually committed by blacks against other blacks. Again, most crime, especially violent crime, is an intra-racial phenomenon. That most black homicide is not a threat to anybody else who is not black. And so some folks that think that it is a threat, or we have to do it because it's threatening little old white ladies, that's not the correct way to look at this. Those people who are most threatened are usually other blacks living in disadvantaged communities. And this is something the media, for whatever reason, it just does not like to point this out. They usually like to focus on blacks who are killed, but only when they're killed by cops, which is a very serious distortion of the truth. And if we look to other sentencing disparities when it comes to drugs, the media almost never focuses on the meth cocaine sentencing disparity, which are more disparate, I should say, than the crack cocaine sentencing disparities. And in federal meth cases in 2006, 54% of defendants were white, 39% were Hispanic, 2% were black. But yet the media never accuses the meth cocaine disparities as being anti-white or Hispanic. It just does not fit with the narrative. And when we look at alcohol, we see another telling disparity, that whites are about 5 times more likely than blacks to be arrested for alcohol-related offenses, such as drunk driving and public intoxication. But no one claims this to be racism against whites, again, because it just doesn't fit with a popular narrative. It seems to catch headlines. This again is one of the reasons why professors generally do not allow you to use mainstream media as scholarly sources, because they are not. They sensationalize stories in order to draw in viewers. Okay, so if you have not read the book in its entirety yet, please do so. I've skimmed over a few important chapters, the ones that deal in particular with prison reform and some of the unintended consequences of that. But I hope this overview, giving you some highlights from the book, has been somewhat helpful. Okay, until next time, bye-bye.